The Toronto Raptors were buyers at the recent trade deadline, yet still missed the playoffs after losing in the play-in tournament, which has fans anticipating a very bleak offseason. But in today's video, I'm going to explain to you why the offseason situation is even worse than you might think it is, and I'm also going to explain why the situation is likely not going to change. Let's get into it. If you're looking for an emotional reaction to the Raptors losing to the Bulls yesterday, then you've come to the wrong place. If you're looking for a legitimate assessment of what the situation is for the Raptors in this upcoming offseason, this is the place for you, and you should stick around for this video. The Raptors yesterday lose in the play-in tournament to the Chicago Bulls. Yes, despite the fact that they were up by 19 points. Yes, despite the fact that they had 36 free throws in this game and missed 18. And yes, despite the fact that the Raptors were buyers at the most recent NBA trade deadline. The front office of this Raptors team bought into a core that still was not good enough to come out of the play-in tournament. And guess what? This team probably could have still finished in a play-in tournament position without trading away a first-round pick at the most recent deadline. So the situation is really dire with the Toronto Raptors, and Masai Ujiri's worst nightmare has really come true. The Raptors are right there in the middle. They are all in on nothing. People said that at the start of the season, people said that at the middle of the season, and here we are at the end of the season, exactly what we were all in on. Nothing. The Raptors are right in the middle, the worst possible spot you can be in North American sports. You're not good enough to make any sort of run in the playoffs, and you're not going to have a very good lottery pick either. It seemed like everybody around the league recognized this. Raptors fans who didn't see it start of the season certainly saw it at the trade deadline. Everybody saw what was going on with this Raptors team except for the front office. And we traded a first-round pick for next season in order to make this happen. And I don't want to completely discount the fact that we also trade away a second-round pick for this season. Depth is important, and it's very clear the Toronto Raptors right now are lacking depth, but the situation right now is going to be extraordinarily difficult to bounce back from. How you can usually recover from being a mediocre team is you fall back at the trade deadline. You assess the situation, decide that the play-in tournament is not for you. Raptors fans, I don't think anybody was interested in making the play-in tournament this season, especially after what they saw from the first half of the season. And to compare to other teams in similar situations, you see how things should be handled when your team is in this spot. At the trade deadline, the Portland Trail Blazers had a better record than the Toronto Raptors. The Raptors right now have the 13th best lottery odds. That could move to 12. That could also move to 11 depending on how OKC and the Bulls do on Friday. But right now, 13 best lottery odds. The Trailblazers, again, who had a better record than the Raptors going into the trade deadline, have the 5th best lottery odds. That kind of shows you how things should be done when you're stuck in the middle of nothing on this season. So the Raptors, it is what it is. They are in this position. There's been plenty of mistakes made by the front office, and things likely are about to get even worse. And it's all down to the tragic mishandling of assets over the last 3 years by the front office, other than adding in Scottie Barnes as the 4th overall pick in the draft, which was, an absolute home run draft pick for the team. Other than that, there's been no supplemental free agents that have been added into this team. There really has been no marquee trades that have made significant differences to this team. We acquired Gary Trent Jr., who yesterday scored 2 points and was 0 of 5 from 3 in the biggest game of the season, a player who wants to earn $18 to $22 million this offseason. What I didn't say here that I should have said was that this trade didn't really make the team better. Gary Trent doesn't really give us any sort of difference with Norman Powell. It was just slightly cheaper and younger, but the team stayed relatively the same. Precious Achiuwa, who was acquired in that sign and trade, had a down year. And you know what? He was actually decent in yesterday's game against the Chicago Bulls, but there's not a lot of faith in what his future is going to be after what we saw from him this season. Last season, the Raptors traded away their first-round pick for a player who played a grand total of 0 minutes yesterday in Thaddeus Young. And that's just scratching the surface of what the situation is for the Raptors. All of this mismanagement of assets from the Raptors management has put us in a situation this summer where we just had a mediocre season. We know things need to change, but likely things are not going to change. Because how are we going to manipulate all of these changes when there are 3 key free agents now for the Raptors in Fred VanVleet, Jakob Poeltl, and Gary Trent Jr.? OG Anunoby is about to enter the last year of his contract. Raptors fans, we know we need changes, whether that's making the team a lot better by going after a star or whether that's going towards the draft lottery. We don't want to be stuck in the middle doing nothing next season. We don't want to be a mediocre team fighting for a play-in tournament spot. Absolutely not. We want to either be forward by acquiring a star or downward by tanking for a draft pick. Do you understand where I'm about to go with this? Let's start with the easy one, tanking for a draft pick. The Raptors traded away that draft pick for 2024 when they acquired Jakob Poeltl at the trade deadline. Now, as far as the actual valuation of Jakob Poeltl as a player, that was a good trade. As far as what it's done to handicap this team for this upcoming summer, that trade still does not make any sense. The trade itself was fine, but the fact that it wasn't accompanied by any other action for this team does not make any sense. Because there's no sense in being a bad team next season because you don't have your pick. So what's the point of tanking if you're not going to even have a draft pick in the process? You may as well continue to be a mediocre team because that's just as good. At least you're playing games and trying to win instead of tanking. So since you can't do that, well, you can try to go acquire a star. Guys like Trae Young, Luka Doncic, Jaylen Brown, among others, seems to be a little bit unsettled. Is that maybe a player? Are any of those guys that maybe you can acquire in the offseason? Well, the Jakob Poeltl trade makes even less sense than you think. Not only do you not have your pick for 2024, there's protections on that pick. So that pick could convey in 2025, which means you can't trade your 2025 pick. There's also protections on that pick for 2025. So the pick you're giving to San Antonio next season could also convey in 2026. So you can't trade your 2026 pick. And since the pick may convey in 2026, you also cannot trade your 2027 pick because there's a possibility you may not own your 2026 pick. If you don't own your 2026 pick, under the Stepien rules, you wouldn't be able to trade your 27 pick. As far as trading picks goes, there needs to be a guarantee that you own the pick before and the pick after. And since there's no guarantee the Raptors own the 2026 pick, they can't trade the 2027 pick. So you can only trade starting at 2028. You can trade the 28 pick, the 29 pick, and the 30 pick. Not all together, though, because of the Stepien rules. You can trade your 28 pick and your 30th pick. 2028 and 2030. Those are the picks the Raptors are allowed to move right now. After this upcoming draft, yes, you can also trade the player that you draft, but given the situation with the Raptors, you don't really want to do that. So if you wanted to go in for a star, which I really think doesn't make much sense, you don't have the assets to actually do that because you don't have the control of your draft assets, draft capital, and draft picks to make that big move. So you can't tank and worry about a draft pick and reset this team, and you can't make this team a whole lot better. So next season, you're still really going to be stuck in the middle of nothing. So what are the offseason plans? What can we actually do to change the product here, which was obviously broken this season? It was broken all throughout the season. The amount of times the Raptors carry double-digit leads and falter in the fourth or just falter in the clutch altogether. Some changes need to be made, 100%. It's just, how are these changes going to be made? You can't lose players for free in terms of free agency. I mean, maybe one can go, but Poeltl, what a disaster it would be if you traded for him and he left for free. I believe he's going to be back. Gary Trent Jr., starting to wonder about his valuation. Is that a player you want to invest in? Fred VanVleet, a player, do you want to invest in him? I mean, you certainly can't let these guys go for free. You want to try to work out a sign and trade for these guys, but sometimes that can be a little more difficult than it seems. In this scenario, we have all of their bird rights, so it's more possible to actually get a trade done because teams will be interested in having those bird rights to build around those players. But you still want to be competitive next season. You have to find the right trades for these guys. It's going to be extremely difficult to manage them. And I don't care what anybody says, like, you just cannot afford to lose any of them for free. There's already been such a mismanagement of assets going out the door and not enough talent coming in to replace them. Like the depth on this team, like the guys coming off the bench yesterday, the 4 players who came off the bench, Gary Trent, who had a bad game, who's a good player, who had a bad game. Achua, who, I mean, jury's still out on what he is. Boucher, who, there's not a lot of good NBA teams that would be giving Chris Boucher regular rotation minutes, and Will Barton, who got bought out this season, only played 2 minutes. But the bench is in a very difficult situation here. there's not enough depth to work with on this team. So the first thing you need to do if you're going to address things the offseason, since you still have to kind of be relatively in the middle here, you got to give these guys more depth. You got to give these guys shooters who can move off the ball, get open off the ball. You got to give these guys some more talented pieces to supplement them. I think that one of the 3 free agents, you have to find a way to sign and trade, whether that's VanVleet, whether that's Trent. I prefer if it was Trent. It could go either way. You got to find a way to work out a sign and trade to recoup assets, bring in a more filled out roster, and just start the process here of getting depth, getting actual solid role players for this team, and then work your way out of this situation, because right now it's a super top heavy roster where the top of the roster still is not really good enough to be contenders, and it doesn't seem like they ever will be good enough to be contenders. The front office has to start that process of rebuilding with the depth, finding pieces, finding an actual good roster of 9, 10, 11 players to work with, because right now, like, the only players you actually trust on this roster, like the list at the absolute max, is 6 players. Time to start addressing the depth issues. Going to be more difficult without draft picks coming up. Only having the first this year, not having our second. Going to be difficult not having our first next season 100%. But those sort of changes, you at least have to get the ball moving in those spots. As far as the coaching goes, I've never felt as low as this about Nick Nurse. If the Raptors were to fire him based on this season, I mean, it would make complete sense. I'm not really largely feeling one way or another on keeping him or firing him, but I'd understand. I think Nick Nurse is a great coach, but I also think sometimes there's a need for a fresh start, just start new, and the Raptors really feel like this core, this team, its roster, this franchise in general, just needs a refresh, just needs a little bit of a reset, and we thought we had it with the Tampa season, but clearly we were mistaken here. Ultimately, what this season boils down to is a Raptors front office who saw the 5th place success from last season, decided to buy in on this core. That made complete sense. But when things didn't go their way and things were not going well this season, the biggest mistake was the fact that they doubled down on a core that was not worth investing in. Buying in at the start of the season made sense. Doubling down at the trade deadline did not make sense. And all of the mistakes, all of the mismanagement of assets over the last 3 years seems to have really, really caught up to this team. The situation in terms of what the team looks like going forward, I think a lot of that is overblown. But the situation for this offseason in particular, I don't think people grasp just how bad of a situation it is. A lack of assets, a lack of flexibility, and a complete and utter lack of direction. It is where nobody wants to be, especially Raptors fans right now. Changes need to happen, yes. I just don't really think some big ones are coming. What do you guys make of the situation for the offseason? Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. And for coverage about the Raptors all throughout the offseason, please make sure you are subscribed to Amateur Hour Sports. All the prospects that you need to know about for the draft, I'm going to be covering them on this channel. So get subscribed today, join the Amateur Hour Army, and I'll see you next time for another video.